People are worried about climate change. They're worried about the amount of carbon that goes into the atmosphere. And I've on this podcast tried to speak to a range of people. I spoke to people who understand the climate and climate scientists, but I've also got Alex Epstein coming on the podcast soon, who's written the book, The Moral Case for Fossil Fuels. He and Marty Bent, who came on the show, their worry is that if we demonize fossil fuels, we risk destroying the grid, or we risk going into periods where there isn't enough power generation. Mm-hmm. We've seen the issues that have happened in Germany recently when they decommissioned all their nuclear facilities, relying on Russian natural gas to power their, I think it's natural gas to power their grid. Should people be worried about this, or is this a red herring? Should we be worried about demonizing fossil fuels? And is there a risk that if we try and go too far to renewables, that the grid can fail, is more likely to fail? And in doing so, if the grid does fail, we know that has a massive implication on society.
The position that I have is like it's an and statement of, it's not like is it A or B or C or D, it's A, B, C, and D, and you kind of find out what the solution is. So I think about the world should be grateful that there were some countries that were early leaders in doing this energy transition, because he who goes first, who goes first, is going to teach you the lessons, right? And so then, what came out of, say, some of the stuff around Germany is saying, what do you need to do different that didn't work over there, right? And so, now there's research that's being published that's becoming very front of mind and grabbing attention. I'm seeing a lot of academic papers written around this, which is just as power systems integrate higher levels of renewables, what is the actual way that you need to incorporate more flexibility through the grid, through different types of market reforms, which is the new rules, right? And then also new products. So my punchline on this is that others went first. They're showing us the way, and we can't do this all at once super fast, right? We can't just go kind of like the example where I said oil going from 100 to 1,000 or Bitcoin going from today's price to $1 million, right? It needs to have some type of kind of a plan to it. You don't have a plan with Bitcoin price, but there needs to be a plan on saying, how do you integrate more renewables? What do you need more for batteries? What do you need more for demand response? How do you make it so that you're not dependent on there's some risk in your system where you're kind of, handcuffed, right? And so the the message I'd say to kind of kind of the Marty Bents there is that I'm pro fossil fuel generation. It works, right? And we just need to have a plan on how do we make this, transition. I'll share a little bit about what's the prize here? There's a big prize, right? And it's that. So solar is, semiconductors, which means it's a technology and it's improving. And so for the first time ever, right, we are now actually manufacturing energy, right? And the solar costs are going at a pace where I think since 1975 when they first started, or somewhere around there, it's the learning rate, which is the, for every doubling of capacity, what percentage decrease in cost did it have? And over the past 50 years or whatever that is, it's averaged something like 30%. And for the last decade, it's been 35. And so we're now at a really low price of solar, right? And, if we get to a point where the cost of solar becomes near zero, right, which it trends down to because it's a technology, right? And we get to something like a $5 solar price, well, that just opens up a whole bunch of things we can't even imagine, right? What are some things that you can do with near zero cost energy? I'm not an expert in this space, but on hydrogen production, all of a sudden becomes extremely economic from renewables and how that can be now used for hydrogen generation and whatnot. So you can look at that and saying in these energy transitions, as you're incorporating more solar, and as these Bitcoin miners are essentially, partnering and taking new offtakes with these solar projects that wouldn't have been built otherwise, they're helping accelerate that, capacity doubling, which is lowering this price and kind of getting to this point that, near zero energy. And I'm thinking call it 50 years out, right? So it's not a short term, but, imagine what that looks like 50 years from now. And there's zero cost energy, and we found ways to harness it and to kind of use that for different kind of applications and and production, whatnot. Like it's truly remarkable. So
Yeah. So my take from you in this is none of this is binary. It's not we should just have lots of coal power plants just so we're protected, and we shouldn't just immediately imagine we're going to transition to renewables. What is happening is the percent of the mix coming from renewables is growing, and the grids are adapting to that and adapting to a more flexible load. And they're doing that with the different insurance products and also by using Bitcoin miners to actually help with that load balancing. So it's really, this is just an evolution of the grids.
that's right. And I would say that what's important start point is that it's reliability first.
Yeah.
Right? Low cost energy afterwards. And like super bold font on reliability. So like how do you make grids reliable in this transition? What are the things, what are the levers that you need to have? And Brad Jones talks about this, about like what levers need to be available for you to manage this transition. And then you go to low cost energy, right? And so then on the fossil fuel side is saying if you're sacrificing reliability, that you don't have the reliability, don't remove those those reliable assets, right? And so you want to keep that.
Do you think we can get to 100% renewable and be reliable and low cost?
Again, anchoring on the 2050 mark, I've seen what some of these energy mixes look like, and I think they're possible, right? And it's hard to believe it's not going to be short term, it's not going to be fast, right? But in this kind of like the future, that you can have 70% wind and solar, you can have 15% hydro, right, which is water, and then you can, in this future again of low cost energy, right, where it's remember, aluminum used to cost more than gold, right? And all of a sudden, arc furnace invented electricity. And
hold on, I didn't even know that.
Yeah.
Okay.
It was something like
Are you talking about aluminium?
aluminum, like cans, and used for like airplanes and pop cans and stuff.
Yeah. Aluminium. Do you know we call it aluminium?
Soccer, right?
Yogurt.
Yeah.
Tomato. Yeah.
Right.
Okay. Aluminum.
Yeah.
I think actually I prefer aluminum. Sounds cooler.
Bioluminescence. Yeah. Aluminum.
Okay.
Yeah.
So aluminium was more expensive to make than gold. I didn't know this.
Yeah, and it was what do you call them? Like the fork, spoons, utensils were made from aluminum because it was very prestigious, because it was super expensive. Right? And then that changed when it was really affordable to make aluminum, and then all of a sudden gold took top spot. Right? It was more scarce. Right? And so like, what happens with what does $5 energy do to the world? Right? Like, what are things that can be done that couldn't be done because they're uneconomic? Right? And so I'm tying back into this, like in this IEA kind of view of the future, and I use that because I don't want it to be like this is my perception of the future. There's reports like IRENA and IEA, and in that future they say that there's like 10% of generation-ish comes from hydrogen generation, which means that hydrogen got so cheap along the way that it became economic, that you could actually use that for your providing some of this flexibility in the future. So you have hydrogen generation, you have batteries, you have demand response, and the conventional generation right now, the coal and the natural gas, it goes from something like 55% to less than 1. So it flippens the demand response in the batteries, right? And so that's kind of the direction that I kind of see.
Okay.
Without Bitcoin mining and the demand response, do you think it would be possible for them to get there?
Yeah, so I think that it's harder. I think that this accelerates it. The example is that, for 20% to come from demand response, right? So like, what are the current applications of demand response, and what are the, where do they get a lot of the value from this? And so give you a couple examples is that, I forget the name of this report I was just recently reading on this, but flexibility from demand response. So the ultimate type of demand response, flexibility from demand response, is something that has it's energy intensive on one process, right? One process, right? Because that way you can just stop and turn that thing, and it's not like an assembly line of things that are all connected. So we'll start with like a steel, right? And so steel has an arc furnace, and so there's the melting of steel. There's I think it's called a ladle of some sort, but very electricity intense. And then it goes downstream. There's like 10 processes all the way to the end. And so if a grid operator, for example, says a nuclear power plant tripped offline, we need backup power, right? The steel or even aluminum, they can provide it, but they can only do it for about 2 hours because, if they turn everything offline, right, then all of a sudden it affects kind of, what they were doing in their production, right? So like the steel starts to harden, right? Yeah, and here's the chart here. It just kind of shows it. So these are the processes, right?
Okay.
And you see there's the melt shop that has the arc furnace and the ladle furnace, and it steps all the way down, right? So it's an assembly line,
Okay.
right?
So do these assembly lines run 24 hours?
Yeah, so these are kind of like industrial facilities. And you often hear in the news that these types of customers get low cost energy, and they usually get better rates because they're consuming larger volumes and they're helping kind of fill demand in the morning times when there's no demand. That's right.
Okay.
So if you look at the steel plant and cement plant, is that if you need to call on these resources, for the steel plant, you can get almost 96%, which is a lot of peak reduction, right? But the challenge is that you can only get that for about 2 hours because they got to essentially get the electricity back on to kind of keep the heat on the arc furnace.
Otherwise, they essentially shut everything down, which is a whole massive process. And then to get it all back going, it's
Totally.
right.
People and processes, coordination, right? So like it's a lot of people involved, a lot of processes involved.
Cement plant is 3 hours.
Yep. So you can see that there's two energy intense processes, the quarry and the cement mill. And so like they don't have as much of a concentration at one location, and they have interdependencies all the way down. So in this example, you can do it for 3 hours, but you're only getting about 70%.
Okay, but the evil Bitcoin mining
Is a single process, very energy intensive on one process, and it's a simply just turn off and for as long as you want, right? Here's an example of batteries and Bitcoin mining as a flexible load. In the future, we need both. It's not an A or B. It's both, right? And there's different use cases that the battery wins. A Bitcoin mine can't store energy and inject it back in the grid if you have a black start and you need to inject. It can't do that, right? So, win for the battery. But if you're in West Texas and, say you're on it's a very windy week, super windy. And it's so windy that, there's not enough demand in that area, and all the power lines that are moving, across West Texas to kind of the major load centers are full. So you've got 2,000 extra megawatts around the clock, right? So these 2,000 megawatts being produced every hour that's extra. If you have a battery, right, the battery and pretend, let's use an example of 1,000 megawatts. So say you have a battery and pretend it's the biggest battery in the world and it's 1,000 megawatts. I don't think there's anything close. They're usually smaller, but it's a 1,000 megawatt battery and it can do 4 hours. So you're going to get 1,000 times 4, so 4,000 megawatt hours, right? And then it has to stop. And then it can't do anything else for the wind. It can't consume the energy. They have to curtail it, right? Because there's nowhere to go, right? So you just had 96 hours, right? And for 92 of those, you had to curtail the wind, and for 4 hours, you could consume with the battery. Because the battery had to wait for prices to come back to above zero or where the wind stops blowing. Otherwise, when it injects the power in the grid, it's going to make things worse.
Okay.
Right? And then insert second is you have 1,000 megawatt Bitcoin mining load that has flexibility. So in this example, 96 hours. And so that mine can consume 1,000 megawatts every single hour, all the way to the end. Right? And so they just consumed 96,000 megawatt hours versus the battery, which was 4,000. So now kind of relate those in payments, right? There was 96,000 megawatt hours that received payment for that energy. And in the first one, there was 4,000 megawatt hours, right? So this is the example where it can kind of soak up the excess wind that would have just been curtailed had otherwise. And curtailed means wasted.